History tells us that civilization began in stages, slowly, carefully, with small villages turning into towns, and towns eventually becoming cities. This is the story we are taught to expect. Stone tools give way to metal. Simple shelters become organized settlements. Symbols evolve into writing. Knowledge accumulates through trial, failure, and correction. It is a comfortable story because it feels natural. Progress moving forward, one step at a time. But when we arrive at Sumer, that story changes tone. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Because history does explain Sumer. It catalogues their cities, it dates their temples, it translates their tablets, it reconstructs their economy, their religion, their kings. Yet there is a part of the story that history rarely lingers on. A pause it tends to pass over quickly. A silence between explanations. Sumer appears, and the narrative continues, but something essential is left unspoken. Around 3500 BCE, in the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, cities emerge that do not behave like beginnings. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. They arrive already organized. Street grids exist from the earliest layers. Large-scale irrigation systems function without evidence of long-term experimentation. Administrative buildings appear alongside religious complexes. And writing does not begin with rough symbols or tentative marks, but with a system capable of expressing law, mathematics, ritual, and astronomy. History explains what they had. It rarely explains how they arrived with it. Archaeology normally leaves behind learning curves, collapsed walls, abandoned canals, discarded prototypes, failed systems buried beneath later improvements. In Egypt we find them. In the Indus Valley we find them. In China we find them. In Sumer, those traces are strangely scarce. Instead of gradual refinement, we encounter competence from the start. The earliest known cuneiform tablets do not read like experiments. They read like records, inventories, receipts, legal disputes, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations. They assume an audience that already understands numbers, measurement, contracts, and timekeeping. This is not how writing usually begins. When humans invent writing, they struggle with it. Symbols shift, meanings change, systems compete, but cuneiform appears standardized across multiple cities almost simultaneously. Its structure is already complex, its rules are already understood. History explains that this happened. It does not pause long enough to ask why it happened this way. The same silence surrounds Sumerian mathematics. Their base 60 system is present from the beginning, not alongside other systems, not competing with alternatives, just there, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, a numerical framework elegant enough that we still use it today. This is not an obvious choice for an early civilization. It requires abstract thinking, foresight, and practical testing. Yet there is no evidence of Sumerians experimenting with other bases before settling on 60. No tablets showing trial systems, no discarded numerical traditions. History notes the brilliance. It rarely addresses the absence of experimentation. Their astronomy follows the same pattern. The earliest Sumerian texts already track celestial bodies with precision, Venus cycles, lunar eclipses, seasonal alignments. This knowledge requires sustained observation across generations. Patterns only emerge when data accumulates over long periods of time, but the records appear already mature, as if the observations began earlier than the tablets themselves. And then there is the language. Sumerian does not belong to any known language family. It has no clear ancestors, no sister languages, no linguistic trail leading to it. Linguists call it an isolate. Languages do not normally appear this way. They evolve, they borrow, they leave fingerprints of contact. Sumerian stands alone. History acknowledges this, then moves on, because the implications are uncomfortable. If the language did not develop locally, then where did it come from? If it belonged to a broader family, where are the others? If it survived alone, what erased the rest? These are questions without easy answers. And when answers are difficult, silence often fills the gap. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this silence. They never described their civilization as a beginning. They never celebrated invention. Instead, their texts repeat a different idea: restoration. Again and again, inscriptions speak of restoring what was before, maintaining ancient designs, preserving words from distant days. They write as caretakers, not pioneers, as if they believed they were standing on the remains of something older. History records these phrases. It translates them, but it tends to interpret them as metaphor, poetic exaggeration, religious tradition, symbolic language. And perhaps it is, but the repetition is striking. Across temples, across cities, across centuries, the same idea returns quietly, that something existed before, that something was lost, that what remained needed to be saved. Beneath many Sumerian cities lies physical evidence of interruption, flood layers, sterile bands of silt separating older occupation from newer rebuilding. Archaeologists have documented them carefully, measured them, dated them. A catastrophic flood occurred in the region. History explains this, but it rarely connects the physical break in the ground to the conceptual break in the culture, the before and the after. The silence lies there, between what history can explain and what it quietly steps around. And once you begin to notice that silence, Sumer no longer feels like a beginning. It feels like a continuation, interrupted, resumed, but never fully explained. When historians encounter gaps in the past, they usually treat them as temporary, missing pieces waiting to be found. Sites yet to be excavated, layers still buried beneath modern cities or shifting rivers. This approach works well in most cases, but with Sumer the gap feels different. It is not simply that something is missing, it is that something appears to have been removed. The cultures that precede Sumer in southern Mesopotamia are well documented. The Ubaid period shows small farming villages, modest architecture, limited social stratification, simple pottery, basic tools. And then, suddenly, Sumer. Not a gradual escalation of complexity, but a leap. Cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants, formalized kingship, monumental religious architecture, specialized labor, long-distance trade networks. The archaeological record does not show the expected intermediate stages. There should be layers where villages struggle to become towns, where irrigation systems fail and are rebuilt, where early administrative systems collapse under their own weight. Instead, the first major Sumerian cities function. This is often explained as preservation bias, the idea that earlier stages existed but were erased by floods, erosion, or time. And this explanation is reasonable, up to a point, because erosion removes structures, floods wash away walls, time destroys organic material. But erosion does not usually erase learning curves. Failed experiments leave traces, discarded ideas leave debris, abandoned systems leave scars in the landscape. In Sumer, those scars are rare. What we find instead are flood layers that act like hard boundaries. Before, after. At sites like Shuruppak and Kish, archaeologists discovered thick deposits of clean silt. No pottery, no tools, no signs of habitation, just clay. Below it, one culture. Above it, another. This is not slow environmental change, it is interruption. The people who rebuilt after these floods did not start from scratch. They arrived with plans. They rebuilt temples on ancient foundations. They re-established irrigation systems quickly. They reinstated administrative practices, and their texts suggest they knew they were rebuilding. Sumerian inscriptions repeatedly emphasize continuity with something older. Temples are described as restorations of ancient houses. Rituals are said to follow designs from distant days. Kings claim legitimacy not through innovation, but through preservation. This language is often dismissed as religious convention, but conventions usually vary. They shift across cities and centuries. In Sumer, the message remains consistent. The past mattered. The past had authority. The past was not invented by them. The Sumerian king list illustrates this mindset clearly. It presents history as a sequence interrupted by catastrophe. Kingship descends, cities rise, then the flood comes. Afterward, kingship descends again. The list does not treat the flood as metaphor, it treats it as a dividing line. Before the flood, reigns are impossibly long. After the flood, they shorten dramatically. History explains this as mythology giving way to history, but the structure is odd. Myth and history are not separated into different genres. They are placed into the same administrative format: names, cities, lengths of reign. This is not how symbolic myth is usually recorded. It reads like a document trying to preserve continuity across a break, as if the authors believed the earlier section mattered, even if its meaning had become unclear. Some scholars have suggested that the long reigns encode something else, not lifespans, but cycles, measurements, epochs. If true, the king list becomes a timekeeping device rather than a story, a way to preserve chronology when normal records were lost. This interpretation is debated, but its existence highlights the problem. Sumerian texts resist simple categorization. They are too procedural to be pure myth, too symbolic to be straightforward history. They occupy a space in between, and history tends to grow quiet in that space. The same quiet surrounds the question of literacy. Sumerian scribal schools appear early, highly structured, standardized curricula, training exercises that assume foundational knowledge. Students copy advanced texts, mathematical tables, legal formulas. These are not beginner materials. Education systems like this usually emerge after long periods of informal learning, but the Sumerian schools appear already formalized, as if teaching had already been happening elsewhere, as if writing itself was not new, only newly recorded. And then there is the issue of memory. Sumerian culture places extraordinary emphasis on preservation, on copying, on maintaining exact wording. Scribes copied texts long after the language stopped being spoken. Accuracy mattered more than comprehension. This behavior suggests reverence, but it also suggests fear. Fear that altering the text would break something, that forgetting would be irreversible. Cultures invent freely when they are confident in continuity. They preserve obsessively when they sense fragility. Sumer behaves like a culture aware of loss. History explains their achievements. It explains their influence. It explains their chronology, but it does not fully explain their urgency. The feeling that runs beneath their civilization is not one of discovery. It is one of salvage. And this is where history often lowers its voice. Because salvage implies wreckage, and wreckage implies something large enough to be worth saving. The deeper we look, the more Sumer feels less like a starting point, and more like a recovery effort carried out in the shadow of something already gone. One of the quietest gaps in the story of Sumer is also one of the most profound: language. Languages are among the most traceable elements of human history. They change slowly. They borrow from neighbors. They leave echoes of where they have been. Even when a language disappears, it leaves descendants, loanwords, grammatical habits, phonetic fingerprints embedded in newer tongues. This is how linguists reconstruct the past. But Sumerian does not fit into that method. It enters history fully formed, already complex, already capable of expressing abstract thought, and it stands alone. No known parent language, no confirmed relatives, no clear lineage. Linguists call it a language isolate. This is rare, not impossible, but rare. And when it happens, there is usually a reason. Languages become isolated when their relatives disappear, when a population is cut off, when a catastrophe removes surrounding speech communities. Sumerian feels like the last voice left standing. It is not primitive. It is not transitional. It is mature. Its grammar is intricate, agglutinative, capable of compressing entire sentences into single words. This kind of linguistic sophistication does not arise suddenly. It requires long use, generations of speakers refining meaning, structure, and nuance. Yet Sumerian appears in writing without any visible developmental trail. History explains this by suggesting that spoken Sumerian existed long before writing, that earlier stages simply were not recorded. This is reasonable, but it does not solve the isolation problem. If Sumerian had been spoken for centuries or millennia before writing, where were the other languages around it? Why do none of them leave recognizable traces? The neighboring Semitic languages are structurally different. Their grammar operates on root systems, not agglutination. Their logic does not align. Sumerian does not look like it emerged from contact with them. It looks like it arrived already distinct. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. That Sumerian belonged to a larger family of languages that no longer exist, languages spoken by people who did not survive. If that is the case, then Sumerian is not an origin point. It is a remnant, a survivor language, the kind that persists when most of its speakers are gone, preserved because it becomes sacred, formal, protected. And that is exactly what happened. Even after Sumerian stopped being spoken in daily life, it continued to be taught, copied, preserved with extreme care. Babylonian scribes learned it centuries later, not to communicate but to access older knowledge. It became a language of memory. This pattern appears repeatedly in cultures that inherit something they fear losing: Latin in medieval Europe, classical Chinese in imperial courts, Sanskrit in ritual contexts. Languages preserved not because they are alive, but because they are believed to contain something irreplaceable. Sumerian fits this pattern almost perfectly, which suggests that by the time it was written down it was already old enough that its origins were forgotten, old enough that it carried authority. History acknowledges this reverence, but it rarely asks why the reverence was necessary. The same pattern appears in Sumerian myth. Their creation stories do not describe effortless perfection. They describe process, trial, error, adjustment. Humans are not spoken into existence. They are shaped, tested, reworked. This is unusual. Most creation myths present instant success, divine command followed by immediate result. Sumerian myths linger on failure, on attempts that do not work, on solutions that require refinement. Historians often interpret this as metaphor, a way to explain human imperfection, but the structure feels procedural, as if the story is preserving the memory of a process rather than inventing symbolism. This same procedural tone appears in their legal texts, medical prescriptions, and administrative records. Everything is careful, ordered, systematic. This is not a culture improvising its way into complexity. It behaves like a culture maintaining a system it already understands. And when systems are inherited rather than invented, silence becomes important. You do not change what you do not fully understand. You copy it, you preserve it, you explain it as tradition. Sumerian culture is full of this behavior. Rituals maintained because they were ancient, texts copied because they were old, designs preserved because they came from before. Before what? That question rarely receives a direct answer. History explains Sumer as the first civilization, but Sumer does not describe itself that way. Its own voice suggests something else, that it stood after a break, after a loss, after a moment when continuity failed. And the more closely we read their words, the more that loss becomes present. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, in the spaces between explanations, in the absence of origins, in the careful preservation of fragments. History moves forward. Sumer looks backward, and the difference between those directions is where the silence lives. Floods are usually described as geological events, water rising, rivers overflowing, sediment settling. They are measured in meters, layers, and dates. But for the people who lived through them, floods were something else entirely. They were psychological events. They erased landscapes. They removed landmarks. They destroyed memory. When a flood recedes, the land does not return as it was. Fields disappear. Boundaries vanish. Familiar paths are gone. And with them, the stories tied to those places begin to fracture. In southern Mesopotamia, the flood layers are unmistakable. Clean bands of silt separating one occupation from another. Clear evidence that something ended abruptly. But what history often overlooks is what happens next. Rebuilding after catastrophe is not the same as beginning from nothing. It is reconstruction under pressure. Survivors do not experiment freely. They rely on what they remember. They repeat what worked before. They cling to fragments of knowledge that feel reliable. Innovation slows. Preservation becomes urgent. This may explain why Sumerian culture feels so careful. Their cities are rebuilt quickly. Their institutions reappear intact. Their systems resume with little visible hesitation. This does not suggest invention. It suggests retrieval. Their texts reflect this mindset. They are concerned with continuity, with maintaining order, with restoring balance. The flood is not treated as mythic chaos. It is treated as interruption. Before the flood, the world functioned one way. After the flood, it had to function again. The King list captures this logic with unsettling clarity. It does not describe the flood in emotional terms. It marks it as a dividing line. Everything before belongs to a different scale of time. Everything after belongs to human time. This shift is not explained. It is recorded, as if the scribes themselves did not fully understand it. Memory behaves this way after trauma. Events are preserved without interpretation. Details remain, but meaning fragments. What survives is structure. The Sumerians preserve structure everywhere. They preserve numerical systems. They preserve ritual forms. They preserve language long after it stops being spoken. They behave like custodians of something fragile. And custodians are not explorers. They do not ask what could be created. They ask what must not be lost. History tends to frame Sumer as confident, as assured, as the birthplace of complexity, but their behavior suggests something more cautious, a civilization aware that knowledge can vanish. That continuity is not guaranteed, that what survived once might not survive again. This awareness changes how we read their myths. Creation stories framed around trial and error take on new weight. They do not celebrate perfection. They acknowledge failure. They accept that things break. This is not the voice of a culture imagining origins. It is the voice of a culture processing loss. Even their gods are not distant. They argue. They make mistakes. They regret decisions. The flood myths describe divine panic, regret, attempts to preserve what can be saved. These are not triumphant narratives. They are cautionary ones. History often treats these stories as symbolic, but symbols usually simplify. These stories complicate. They linger on consequence. They remember disruption. And the more we consider the psychological impact of catastrophe, the more Sumer's urgency makes sense. Why they wrote so much. Why they preserved so carefully. Why they spoke so often of restoration. They were not writing to explain the world. They were writing to hold it together. This is the part history rarely emphasizes, because it shifts the narrative. Sumer stops being the confident beginning of civilization and starts looking like a civilization standing on unstable ground, aware that it was not the first to build, only the first to write after something ended. And once that perspective settles in, the silence in history becomes easier to hear, not as ignorance, but as absence, the sound of something that did not survive long enough to speak for itself. Writing is often described as a breakthrough, a leap forward, a sign of confidence. But in Sumer, writing feels less like ambition and more like urgency. The earliest tablets are not poems, they are not philosophy, they are not stories meant to inspire. They are records, lists, accounts, measurements, instructions. Writing appears not as expression but as preservation. This matters, because when cultures invent writing for the first time, they often begin with symbols of meaning. Names, images, stories. Sumer begins with administration, with control of grain, with tracking labor, with recording obligations. This suggests a society already complex enough to fear losing track of itself. Writing becomes a tool against forgetting, and forgetting, in Sumer, seems to be a real threat. The volume of tablets is staggering, tens of thousands buried in archives carefully stored. This is not casual documentation, it is systematic. They recorded what people owed, what they received, what they promised, what they observed in the sky. They recorded procedures, how to build, how to measure, how to heal, how to calculate. This is not knowledge being discovered, it is knowledge being safeguarded. Scribes were trained with precision. They copied older texts word for word. Errors were corrected, not reinterpreted. The act of copying mattered more than understanding. This is unusual. Most cultures adapt knowledge freely. They improve it. They personalize it. Sumer preserved it. Even when the language itself faded from daily use, the texts remained sacred. Why preserve something you no longer speak? Because it contains something you fear losing. This behavior suggests that writing was not created to invent civilization, but to stabilize it, to lock it in place, to prevent erosion, not of land, but of memory. And memory, once broken, is difficult to restore. The flood layers beneath their cities tell us that continuity had already failed once, that there had been a before, and then silence. Writing becomes the answer to that silence. Clay tablets survive fire. They survive water. They harden under heat. They are not delicate. They are designed, intentionally or not, to endure catastrophe. This may be why clay was chosen. Papyrus rots. Wood burns. Stone is heavy and slow to produce. Clay is immediate, abundant, durable. It is a medium for people who expect disruption. And the Sumerians behaved like people who expected it again. Their obsession with preservation suggests foresight shaped by experience, not optimism, caution. They wrote as if they knew how easily knowledge disappears, as if they had already watched it happen. History often frames this as administrative necessity, but necessity alone does not explain the tone. There is no celebration in their records, no pride in invention, only order, consistency, repetition. The same formulas recur across centuries, the same phrases, the same structures. This creates a feeling of stillness, a civilization holding its breath, trying not to disturb what remains, and this brings us back to the quiet part of the story. History explains how writing enabled civilization. It explains how bureaucracy supports complexity, but it rarely asks why this civilization wrote so urgently, so thoroughly, so early. Why did they feel the need to record everything? Why did they behave as if forgetting was more dangerous than ignorance? Because forgetting implies loss, and loss implies something worth remembering, something already gone. Sumer does not read like a culture discovering itself. It reads like a culture afraid of forgetting who it used to be. When archaeologists search for the origins of a civilization, they expect debris. They expect mistakes, false starts, broken attempts buried beneath success. This is how human progress usually looks in the ground. But Sumer is different. Beneath its cities, there is not a gradual build-up. There is a gap. Below the earliest monumental structures, the soil goes quiet. No layers of experimental architecture, no half-formed writing systems, no clumsy prototypes of tools that improve over time. Instead, there is absence, a clean break. The archaeological record jumps. One moment, small agricultural villages. The next, cities with planning, bureaucracy, mathematics, astronomy, and law. This discontinuity has a name. Scholars call it the Sumerian problem. And the problem is not that Sumer developed quickly, it is that it does not appear to develop at all. It arrives complete. Civilizations normally leave footprints. You see villages become towns, towns become cities. Specialists emerge slowly. Writing systems evolve from pictures into symbols. Metallurgy improves through trial and failure. Mathematics grows from counting to abstraction. In Sumer, all of this appears already in place. The footprints are missing. This absence is not subtle, it is glaring, and it forces an uncomfortable question. If Sumer did not develop these systems locally, where did they come from? Some propose that earlier layers were destroyed. Floods, erosion, the shifting of rivers. This is possible, but destruction usually leaves traces, collapsed walls, scattered tools, fragments of transition. Sumer gives us silence instead. Other scholars suggest the knowledge came from elsewhere, from neighboring cultures, but those cultures do not show the same sophistication at the same time. There is no clear source to borrow from, which leaves us with a strange scenario. A civilization appears with knowledge that seems older than the ground it stands on, as if it had been transplanted, or inherited, or remembered. What makes this more unsettling is how the Sumerians describe themselves. They do not write myths about invention. They do not celebrate discovery. They rarely say, "we created." Instead, they say things like restored, brought back, carried forward. Their temples are not said to be founded. They are rebuilt. Their laws are not established. They are reaffirmed. Their kings do not claim originality. They claim legitimacy through continuity. Again and again, inscriptions refer to ancient designs, older patterns, distant days. This language is not metaphorical in tone. It is administrative, precise, almost cautious, as if they were aware they were stepping into something already old. The silence beneath their cities mirrors the silence in their explanations. They do not fill the gap with legend. They acknowledge it, quietly, and this silence invites interpretation, not speculation. Interpretation, because silence, when consistent, is information. If Sumer had emerged from nothing, we would expect stories of beginnings. If they had invented writing, we would expect pride. If they had built the first cities, we would expect mythology around the act. Instead, we find restraint, as if beginnings were not their story, as if the beginning had already happened. Elsewhere, earlier, lost. The flood layers complicate this further. In several Sumerian cities, archaeologists found thick layers of sterile silt. Not gradual flooding, a sudden event, a break in habitation. Before the flood layer, one culture. After it, another. This aligns disturbingly well with Sumerian texts. They speak of a world divided, before the flood, after the flood. They do not treat the flood as allegory. They treat it as a boundary, a reset, and after that reset, civilization resumes. Not slowly, not cautiously, but decisively, as if something had survived, something compact enough to be carried forward, not buildings, not cities, knowledge. Knowledge is light. It moves with people. It can be preserved without infrastructure. It can outlast collapse. If there was a civilization before the flood, if it was coastal, if it was submerged as sea levels rose, then its cities would be gone, its monuments erased, but its knowledge could remain, passed orally, encoded symbolically, eventually written down. This would explain the gap, not as absence, but as burial. It would explain why Sumerian civilization feels older than its own ruins, why its systems feel inherited rather than invented, why its language stands alone, why its myths read like memory, not imagination, why its writing is urgent, why its tone is cautious, why it behaves like a culture that knows how fragile continuity is. Archaeology often tells us what existed, but sometimes what matters is what should exist and doesn't. The missing scaffolding of Sumerian development is not just a technical issue. It is a narrative fracture, a hint that the story of civilization does not begin where we want it to, that the line we draw at Sumer may not be a beginning at all, but a restart. And restarts always imply something ended. The Sumerians lived among ruins, not just physical ones, cultural ones. Their entire civilization feels like an act of reconstruction, careful, methodical, intent on not losing what little remained. They were not looking forward. They were looking backward, trying to stabilize something already damaged, and this is why Sumer feels unfinished, not because it failed, but because it stands at the edge of a missing chapter, a chapter we have not recovered, a chapter that may never be recovered, but whose shadow still shapes everything that came after. If Sumer feels like a restart, then its stories begin to make more sense. Not as myths invented to explain the unknown, but as memories shaped to survive collapse. Modern readers often dismiss ancient myths because they do not resemble science. They speak in symbols. They use gods instead of mechanisms. They describe actions in human terms. But myth is not fiction. Myth is compression. When a culture lacks technical language, it uses narrative. When it lacks equations, it uses characters. When it cannot preserve blueprints, it preserves stories. In this way, myth becomes an archive, not of beliefs, but of processes. And when we read Sumerian myths slowly, something unusual emerges. They do not sound like poetry. They sound procedural. Creation does not happen in an instant. It unfolds. There are mistakes, adjustments, iterations. Beings are formed, evaluated, and reassigned roles based on limitations. This is not how symbolic myths usually behave. Symbolic myths idealize, they simplify, they declare perfection. Sumerian myths document failure. They acknowledge inefficiency. They record correction. This is not the language of worship. It is the language of engineering translated into story. And this pattern extends beyond creation. Their gods argue. They debate policy. They vote. They make decisions with consequences they later regret. In the flood narrative, the gods do not act as omniscient beings. They panic. They mourn. They starve without human offerings. This portrayal is deeply untheological, but it is profoundly human, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if the gods in these stories are not metaphysical beings at all? What if they are placeholders, names assigned to actors whose true nature had already faded from memory? If a group of people possessed advanced knowledge before catastrophe, if they taught survivors how to rebuild, if generations passed, their names would persist, their actions would persist, but their context would not. Over time, teachers become ancestors. Ancestors become legends. Legends become gods. This process is not hypothetical. It happens everywhere. In Egypt, early rulers are later described as divine. In China, legendary emperors blur into celestial figures. In Mesoamerica, culture bringers descend from the sky and vanish. In every case, memory inflates as distance increases. The Sumerians may not have invented gods. They may have inherited names. and used those names as containers for preserved instruction. This would explain why their gods teach practical skills: how to irrigate, how to measure land, how to track stars, how to govern cities. These are not divine mysteries. They are technical knowledge, and they appear fully formed. There is no story of trial, no story of discovery, only instruction. This is important, because instruction implies prior mastery. Someone already knew, and the Sumerians are clear about one thing: they did not know first, they were taught. This teaching is described as descending from heaven, but heaven in ancient language does not mean space. It means above, beyond, not here. If survivors encountered teachers from elsewhere, from higher ground, from outside the flooded world, this language would fit. Not aliens, not fantasy, just perspective. High places become heaven when the lowlands drown. What is above becomes sacred when what is below is lost. This interpretation does not require speculation, it requires restraint. Because the Sumerians never claim more than this. They never describe the gods as eternal creators of reality. They describe them as organizers, administrators, engineers. Their divine authority comes from knowledge, not omnipotence. And when knowledge disappears, authority becomes myth. The role of the scribe then becomes critical. Scribes are not storytellers. They are preservers. They copy faithfully, even when meaning fades, even when context is lost. They preserve because they know something matters, even if they no longer understand why. This is why Sumerian texts feel cautious, why they repeat phrases, why they avoid embellishment, why they copy lists, measurements, and names obsessively. This is archival behavior, not myth-making, and it explains the tone of quiet urgency that runs through their writing, as if they were aware that memory was eroding, that something was slipping away, and that clay was the last defense against forgetting. The tablets do not argue. They do not persuade. They do not proclaim truth. They simply record. And recording is an act of trust. Trust that someone in the future will understand, or at least notice that something does not add up, that the story feels interrupted, that the foundation is missing, that civilization seems to begin in the middle of a sentence. Sumer is not unfinished because it failed. It is unfinished because it remembers a beginning it cannot fully explain. And memory, once broken, cannot be repaired, only preserved. If memory was fragile, then writing became an emergency technology. Not art, not literature, not expression, preservation. The Sumerians did not choose clay because it was elegant. They chose it because it endured. Papyrus burns. Wood rots. Stone is heavy and rare. Clay is ordinary, everywhere. Soft when needed, permanent when fired, and, most importantly, accident-proof. When cities burned, clay tablets hardened. When archives collapsed, tablets survived. Disaster did not erase them, it sealed them. This is not coincidence, this is design. A civilization obsessed with preservation would choose the one medium that becomes stronger when the world falls apart. And this tells us something uncomfortable. They expected collapse. You do not engineer memory against catastrophe unless catastrophe is already part of your worldview or part of your past. Sumerian cities were not built as if the world would remain stable. They were built as if interruption was inevitable. Archives were buried. Foundation tablets were sealed into walls. Texts were copied redundantly across cities. The same lists, the same king names, the same rituals. Repetition is not inefficiency. Repetition is insurance. And this explains why so much of Sumerian writing is administrative. Receipts, inventories, measurements, legal codes, astronomical logs. Modern readers find this boring, but boring is the point. Emotion fades, structure survives. A myth can be distorted, a number cannot. A law can be reinterpreted, a measurement cannot. If you are trying to preserve knowledge across generations that may not understand its origin, you preserve form, not explanation. This is why Sumerian texts often feel cold, detached, unemotional. They do not persuade, they do not justify, they simply state. And this style aligns perfectly with a civilization acting as a custodian, not an inventor. Inventors explain. Custodians copy. They are careful not to alter, careful not to improve, careful not to modernize, because modernization breaks continuity. This is also why Sumerian education was rigid. Scribal schools emphasized copying verbatim. Errors were punished. Creativity was discouraged. The goal was accuracy, not originality. A scribe was not valued for insight. He was valued for fidelity. This mindset makes sense if the knowledge being copied was already considered ancient, already considered fragile, already considered incomplete. You do not experiment with an inheritance you do not fully understand. You protect it. And this leads to the most revealing detail of all. The Sumerians never wrote a history of their own origins. There is no founding narrative, no story of first settlement, no explanation of how writing was invented, no myth of discovery. This absence is deafening. Every civilization tells the story of how it began. Egypt tells of the first kings. China tells of the Yellow Emperor. Rome tells of Romulus. Sumer tells nothing. Only that kingship descended. Only that knowledge was given. Only that this was a restoration. It is as if the beginning had already been lost. And without a beginning you cannot tell a story. You can only maintain what remains, which suggests something profound. Sumer may not represent the birth of civilization. It may represent the point at which civilization realized it had already survived something devastating. A reset, a fracture, a moment where continuity was broken so completely that even memory of the beginning dissolved. All that remained were fragments, techniques without origins, systems without inventors, language without ancestors, stories without context, and the quiet awareness that something essential was missing. This awareness explains the tone of Sumerian culture, not triumphant, not celebratory, but cautious, formal, almost restrained, as if they knew they were standing on ruins they could not fully see, and that their task was not to surpass the past, but to prevent further loss. If this is true, then the unfinished feeling we sense is not accidental. It is inherited. We feel it because they felt it. They were already looking backward, already aware that they were not at the beginning, already aware that something had ended before they arrived. Sumer did not believe it was new. It believed it was late, and that belief shaped everything, the way they wrote, the way they built, the way they counted time, the way they measured the sky. Everything points to a civilization attempting to anchor itself to something older than memory, something they could feel but not reach. And clay was their answer, a medium slow enough to force care, permanent enough to survive chaos, and humble enough to exist everywhere. Clay does not demand belief. It only demands attention, and thousands of years later it still waits, not explaining, not persuading, simply present, as if to say, this is what we managed to save. The way the Sumerians understood time may be the clearest clue of all. They did not see time as a straight line, not a march forward, not progress toward something better, not a ladder climbing upward. Time to them was circular, layered, repetitive, restorative. This is why their most important numbers repeat. 60, 360, 3,600. These are not just convenient values, they describe cycles. The sky does not move forward, it returns. Planets do not advance, they repeat paths. Seasons do not innovate, they come back. Sumerian astronomy was not predictive in the modern sense, it was confirmatory. They were not asking what will happen next, they were asking when it will happen again. This mindset explains the king list. To modern readers it looks absurd. Trains lasting tens of thousands of years, impossible lifespans, clearly myth. But that assumption only holds if time is linear. If time is cyclical, then those reigns are not lifetimes. They are durations, phases, epochs. The king list does not function like a genealogy. It functions like a clock. Each king marks a completed cycle. Each reign represents stability until disruption. And then, the flood. The flood is not just a disaster in Sumerian thought. It is a reset, a punctuation mark in time. Everything before it belongs to one order, everything after it belongs to another. This is why the phrase repeats so precisely, after the flood had swept over, kingship was lowered from heaven again. Again. Not for the first time. Again. Meaning it had happened before. Meaning history itself was cyclical, ordered, broken, restored. The Sumerians did not believe they were moving toward the future. They believed they were repeating the past under worse conditions. This explains their obsession with measurement. Why track the sky so carefully? Why log Venus for decades? Why calculate eclipse cycles? Because if time repeats, then the sky becomes memory. The heavens remember what the earth forgets. Stars do not flood. Planets do not burn. If knowledge was lost on the ground, it could be recovered from above. This is why temples were aligned astronomically, why ziggurats functioned as observation platforms, why priests were astronomers. They were not worshipping the sky. They were consulting it, looking for confirmation that order still existed, that cycles were still intact, that the universe had not forgotten itself. This also explains why Sumerian culture lacks utopian imagination. They did not envision a better world ahead. They remembered a better world behind. Their myths do not promise salvation. They warn of repetition. Disruption followed by restoration. Stability followed by collapse. Again and again. This worldview produces caution. Not optimism, not despair, but restraint. And this restraint permeates everything. Their art is formal. Their writing is precise. Their laws are structured. Emotion is contained. Everything is bounded, as if excess itself might provoke catastrophe, and perhaps in their memory it already had. If the Sumerians believed they were living in a diminished age, then innovation would be dangerous, change would be suspicious, originality would threaten continuity. Better to repeat correctly than to invent incorrectly. Better to preserve fragments than to risk losing them entirely. This may be why Sumer stagnated technologically after its sudden rise, the explosive emergence. Then, maintenance, refinement, copying, not acceleration. They did not push forward. They held on, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if the unfinished feeling we sense is not because Sumer collapsed, but because Sumer never believed it was complete to begin with? What if it was always operating under the assumption that it was working with remnants, trying to stabilize a world already damaged, trying to remember something already broken? In that sense, Sumer is not mysterious because it rose too quickly. It is mysterious because it behaves like a civilization in recovery, after something immense, after something unnamed, after something no longer fully remembered. And if that is true, then the question is no longer, how did Sumer begin? But rather, what ended before it? Because civilizations that see time as linear celebrate beginnings. Civilizations that see time as cyclical mourn interruptions. Sumer mourns, quietly, formally, in clay, and that mourning echoes forward, into us, because we inherited not just their numbers, but their calendar, not just their measurements, but their sense of time, and perhaps got their unease. What we don't find in Sumer may be more important than what we do. Archaeology is trained to celebrate discovery, walls, temples, tablets, tools, but silence is harder to read, and Sumer is surrounded by it. There should be precursors, there should be transitional stages, there should be mistakes, crude prototypes, half-formed ideas, but they are missing, not destroyed, not eroded, missing. Between simple village life and fully organized cities, there is a gap, and not a small one. Civilizations do not leap. They accumulate, they stumble, they leave debris behind. But Sumer appears clean, too clean, as if the messy phase happened somewhere else, or somewhen else. This gap is often explained away. Floods erase evidence, rivers shift, sites remain buried, all true, but not sufficient, because even floods leave traces, even destruction leaves disorder. What we see instead is continuity without origin, finished systems with no childhood. This silence extends beyond architecture. There is no gradual evolution of writing, no progression from symbols to abstraction. Cuneiform arrives structured, standardized, shared across cities, which implies training, and training implies teachers. But there are no teachers in the archaeological record, no schools of invention, only schools of copying. Likewise, metallurgy. The earliest bronze artifacts are competent, balanced alloys, functional tools, no experimental slag layers, no evidence of learning curves. Stone tools do not slowly transition. Bronze appears ready. Language follows the same pattern. Sumerian has no relatives, no borrowings, no hybrid grammar. It does not look like a language formed through contact. It looks like a language arriving intact. and then stopping. It does not evolve much. It persists, frozen, preserved, like everything else. Archaeology prefers explanations that keep history simple, linear, predictable, but Sumer resists that structure because its silence is patterned, consistent, across domains, across centuries. Silence this uniform does not feel accidental, it feels intentional, which leads to a disturbing possibility. What if the missing stages were never meant to be preserved? What if they belonged to a world that did not survive? If a civilization collapsed catastrophically, its experimental phase would not be recorded. Only its mature forms might endure. Only what was already formalized, already standardized, already stable. Those are the things worth copying, worth rebuilding, worth remembering. Everything else disappears with the people who needed it. This would explain why Sumer appears as a civilization without adolescence. It inherited adulthood, but not childhood, and this reframes the flood, not just as destruction, but as filtration. Only certain kinds of knowledge survive catastrophe. Practical systems, abstract structures, symbolic frameworks, things that can be memorized, copied, rebuilt. But processes, origins, rationale, those vanish. This also explains why Sumerian texts rarely explain why things are the way they are. They tell you how, not why. How to measure, how to divide, how to align, how to record, but not how these methods were discovered. Because discovery happened before, outside the memory horizon, outside the written record. The silence, then, is not ignorance, it is loss. And loss leaves patterns, just like preservation does, which means we should stop asking why Sumer doesn't show development and start asking what kind of world produces only endings. Because Sumer does not look like a beginning. It looks like a midpoint, a restart, a stabilization phase, a civilization doing its best to prevent further collapse. And that explains something else archaeology struggles with. Why Sumerian cities were rebuilt repeatedly on the same sites, layer upon layer, same locations, same layouts, same sacred spaces. They were not expanding outward, they were anchoring downward, returning to places already sanctified, already known, already remembered. Change introduces risk, familiarity offers control, and control matters when the past includes catastrophe, so the silence remains, not as a void, but as a boundary, a line beyond which memory could not pass, and every Sumerian tablet, in its quiet precision, respects that line, never speculating, never inventing origins, never filling the gap, because to them that gap was real and dangerous. The unfinished quality we feel may not be because something is missing from the evidence. It may be because something was missing from their world, and they knew it. Civilizations carry memory the same way individuals do, not only through stories, but through behavior, through what they repeat, through what they avoid, through what they refuse to imagine. If the Sumerians lived after a collapse, then their culture would not only preserve knowledge, it would manage fear, and fear leaves fingerprints. Trauma does not announce itself. It organizes life quietly. After catastrophe, stability becomes sacred, rules become anchors, structure becomes safety, and this is exactly what we see in Sumer. Their laws were rigid, their rituals precise, their calendars fixed. Deviation was not innovation, deviation was risk. This is why their society feels so formal, so controlled, so measured. They were not building for expression, they were building for endurance. When a civilization has witnessed the loss of continuity, it stops trusting improvisation. It favors repetition. It elevates tradition. It teaches obedience to form, not because form is holy, but because form survived. This psychological posture reshapes everything. Religion becomes procedural, not ecstatic. Gods are administrators, not mysteries. Priests are technicians, not prophets. Rituals are schedules, not revelations. The divine world mirrors the human one, hierarchical, ordered, regulated. The Anunnaki do not behave like abstract cosmic forces. They convene councils. They argue policy. They issue decrees. They resemble a governing body. Why? Because a traumatized society models the universe on governance. Chaos is what they fear most. So even the gods must be organized. This also explains why Sumerian myths lack redemption. There is no promise that catastrophe will never happen again. No final victory over disorder. No end of history. There is only management, balance, temporary stability, and eventual disruption. Again. Living with that expectation changes how people relate to time. The future is not hopeful. It is conditional. The goal is not progress. It is survival. And survival requires vigilance. This is why Sumerian culture feels watchful, as if always waiting. Not for salvation, but for warning. The sky is watched. The rivers are monitored. Omens are catalogued. Dreams are interpreted. Everything is scanned for signs. Not because they were superstitious, but because they believed disaster announces itself. And if catastrophe had come before, then it could come again. This worldview produces a civilization that never relaxes, never fully celebrates, never assumes permanence, and that emotional restraint is visible in their art. Figures are static, faces are composed. Emotion is minimal, eyes are wide, always open, always alert. Sumerian statues do not express joy. They express attention. They are not relaxed. They are vigilant. Even their prayers reflect this mindset. They are not confessions, they are maintenance requests. Keep the order intact, keep the flood away, keep the decrees stable, keep what remains from breaking, which suggests something deeply human. The Sumerians may have been the first civilization to understand loss on a civilizational scale. Not just death, not just famine, but the loss of an entire way of knowing. And once that happens, a culture never fully recovers. It becomes careful, protective, conservative. It treats knowledge like a fragile inheritance, not like a tool for expansion. And this is why the unfinished feeling persists. They were not finishing something. They were holding something together, trying to keep fragments aligned long enough for the next generation. And now, thousands of years later, we read their tablets, we trace their measurements, we live inside their timekeeping, and we feel it too. That sense of something interrupted, something incomplete, something that does not resolve, because trauma does not resolve, it echoes, and Sumer echoes, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, in clay, waiting. What changes a civilization the most is not discovery, it is realization. And the most dangerous realization a culture can have is this: we are not the first. Once that understanding settles in, everything shifts. Progress loses its innocence. Innovation loses its urgency. History stops feeling open-ended. And identity becomes fragile. The Sumerians never claimed primacy. They never declared themselves the origin. Instead, they positioned themselves as inheritors, caretakers, stewards of something older. And that posture is rare. Most civilizations erase what came before. They mythologize themselves as beginnings. They rewrite memory to justify authority. But Sumer did not erase. It preserved, even when preservation was uncomfortable, even when it undermined their own importance. They wrote down that knowledge was given, that kingship descended, that wisdom belonged to distant days. They did not replace the past. They deferred to it. This is not the behavior of a culture trying to dominate history. It is the behavior of a culture trying to remain aligned with it. And alignment matters when you believe history can break. If the past collapsed once, then continuity itself becomes sacred, which explains why Sumer did not try to surpass what came before. They did not claim improvement. They did not boast of advancement. They measured, they recorded, they copied, as if the goal was not to become greater, but to remain accurate. Accuracy becomes moral when memory is all that remains. This mindset also reshapes identity. A civilization that believes it is the first asks, what can we become? A civilization that knows it is not asks, what must we not lose? Sumer asked the second question, and that question produces restraint. It produces humility, and it produces anxiety, because if you do not know what was lost, you cannot know how close you are to losing more. This may be why Sumer never imagined an end to history. No final age, no ultimate resolution, only cycles, order, disruption, restoration, again. They lived without the comfort of finality, and that absence of closure is what we feel. The unfinished quality is not mystery, it is honesty. They knew the story was already incomplete. They were not pretending otherwise. They did not try to finish it. They simply added what they could, carefully, quietly, in clay. And now we stand where they once stood, looking backward, trying to reconstruct a beginning we cannot see, feeling the same discontinuity, the same silence, the same gap. Because when a civilization inherits fragments, its descendants inherit questions, and perhaps that is the final legacy of Sumer. Not writing, not mathematics, not timekeeping, but the unsettling awareness that human history may not be a straight ascent, but a series of recoveries, moments where memory barely survives catastrophe, moments where someone decides to record what remains, because it may be all that carries forward. If that is true, then Sumer is not unfinished because it failed. It is unfinished because it was never meant to conclude. It was meant to bridge, to hold, to transmit. And somewhere beyond the reach of tablets, beyond flood layers, beyond silence, there may be another beginning, one we have not found, or one we are not yet ready to recognize, and until then, the clay waits. Every civilization leaves behind ruins, but some leave behind questions. Sumer left both. We keep searching their cities for beginnings, foundations, first steps, origins, but perhaps we are looking in the wrong direction. Because Sumer does not behave like a civilization asking where it is going. It behaves like one asking what survived. Its texts do not announce. They remember. Its monuments do not celebrate. They stabilize. Its myths do not explain creation. They manage aftermath. And this suggests that the most important question Sumer leaves us is not historical. It is existential. What do you become when you realize you are living after something immense, but you do not know its name? What kind of culture do you build when you inherit fragments without context? When knowledge exists, but its origin is gone? When systems function, but their purpose is partially forgotten? You build carefully. You build formally. You build with restraint. You build as if the ground beneath you once failed, and maybe as if it could fail again. The Sumerians lived inside that awareness. And so unknowingly do we. We still divide time using their numbers. We still measure space using their logic. We still organize days, hours, and angles according to decisions made before recorded history felt young. We do this without thinking, without remembering, without asking why, which may be the most Sumerian inheritance of all, because they too were using systems whose origins they no longer understood, preserving forms without explanations, trusting continuity over comprehension. And now we find ourselves in the same position, standing on structures older than our memory, using tools older than our stories, living inside a timeline that may not be linear at all. The unfinished feeling does not come from Sumer alone. It comes from recognition, from realizing that history might not be a clean ascent, but a fragile relay, passed forward through collapse, through silence, through loss, each civilization holding the thread just long enough before handing it to the next. Sumer held it in clay. We hold it in data, different medium, same urgency, and just like them, we assume we are near the beginning, near the cutting edge, near the future, but maybe we are standing somewhere in the middle, between a forgotten world and another that has not yet arrived. If Sumer teaches us anything, it is this: civilization does not always begin. Sometimes it resumes, and when it does, it carries scars, patterns, gaps, and an unshakable sense that something essential is missing. That is not failure. That is memory trying to survive. So when we look at the Sumerians and feel that something about them is unfinished, we are not sensing their incompleteness. We are sensing our own position in a story that did not start with us, and may not end with us either. The clay tablets are silent now, but silence does not mean absence. It means waiting, for someone to notice that the story does not resolve, that it never did, and perhaps was never meant to.